Bethany McLean has written a couple of books that became the definitive books, really, on the economic calamities, the major economic calamities of this century. She wrote The Smartest Guys in the Room about the collapse of Enron. She wrote the book Shaky Ground about the Great Recession and the housing market crash. She has a new book. It's called Big Fail, and it's the story of Operation Warp Speed, which she calls a resounding success. So why the name Big Fail? The Big Fail, what the pandemic revealed about who America protects and who it leaves behind. Bethany McLean is a contributing editor for Vanity Fair. Again, the book, The Big Fail, what the pandemic revealed about who America protects and who it leaves behind. An accounting of how warp speed came to be and what it produced and who produced it. Bethany McLean joins us now. Bethany, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with a gentleman that whose name most people do not know, that is central to your book, as I understand it from reading excerpts. Moncef Slaoui, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, the retired head of the vaccine department at the pharma giant GlaxoSmithKline. He became sort of a central organizing figure in President Trump's Operation Warp Speed. Give us the details.
Sure. So I wanted to address something you said when you started. The title of the book seems at odds with the fact that we call it Warp.
Yeah.
So Warp Speed is one part of the book. It's about more of America's response than just Warp Speed. That said, I totally agree with you. Warp Speed, in our view, was a big success. It was a really successful collaboration between government and industry. And the guy who ran it, Moncef Slaoui, really gave up a lot, including his stock in Moderna, which would have made him many millions of dollars to come run this. And in a world where we don't see people give up things for the benefit of their country anymore, I think the story of Warp Speed is one of cooperation between government and industry, and it's one of people being willing to put aside their politics and put aside their chances to make a lot of money in order to do what they felt was the right thing. So there's something, to me, very inspirational about that story.
And so how does he get involved, and how does he, with some obviously many others in supporting roles, drive the Warp Speed initiative that President Trump greenlighted?
So he is chosen out of a group of people to come in and run this because they're looking for somebody who understands how vaccines can get made. And it turns out this is really complicated because it's not just the science behind producing a vaccine that will work against COVID. It's actually the industrial scale-up necessary to manufacture the vaccine in America, because over the last decades, we have outsourced so much and part of our book deals with how we outsourced all of the manufacture of PPE that became so necessary in the pandemic. And obviously, we've outsourced a lot of other things, but we outsourced a lot of the processes and the goods needed to make vaccines. So figuring out getting all that stuff to America so that you could actually make the vaccines once you had a vaccine that worked is a really important part of the Warp Speed story that I think people don't understand. And the fact that Warp Speed did that is why America had vaccines available before any place else.
And you suggest, at least in the excerpts that I've read, that one of the key decisions that was made by President Trump was really delegating the job to these pharma experts and other logistical experts to figure out how to get from where they were in the spring of 2020 to a vaccine and 100 million doses delivered by the end of the year. That the administration, this has been reported, of course, the administration tore down some of the barriers that are usually erected to slow down the process of drug development and let these guys do what they needed to do, working together sort of outside of the realm of partisan politics to advance the project.
Yeah, they really did, and I find it such an interesting story because it is many of the people who ran Warp Speed were not Trump supporters. Again, they did this
Mm-hmm.
not to support the administration. They did it because it was the right thing to do, and I think it's in a world where we are so often victims of our partisan divides. I think that is such an inspirational story. Moncef Slaoui could have said, "No, I'm not doing this. I'm a Democrat. I'm not working for the Trump administration," and he didn't. And that was true of many of the people involved in Warp Speed. They set aside politics, and I think it's important that the Trump administration did protect this initiative. Somebody said to me that it might not have gotten done in any administration because the president wouldn't have been able to be as hands off and to let politics stay out of it the way Trump did. And people involved in Warp Speed who were not necessarily fans of Jared Kushner going into this said that he was the one who protected it and made sure that politics didn't interfere with Warp Speed being able to make progress. And so I think there are important lessons in there that are broader than Warp Speed about being able to delegate and making sure that things can get done without interference.
Well, is there anybody who called the pandemic accurately?
No, there really isn't, and I don't think that that's something you can criticize America for because our country hadn't been hit. Most pandemics had bypassed us, and we hadn't been hit by something like this in generations. But I do think the book deals with. Part of the book is very critical of lockdowns and of the policies we pursued because I do think we lurched into unthinking way of tackling this in a way that hurt some of the least advantaged in our society, and we once again allowed partisan divides instead to prevail over information. So instead of looking and saying, there might be something to say for the path that Florida is pursuing. If you lived in a blue state, you said Florida's killing people. We have to lock down and wear masks. And if you lived in a red state, you said I don't wear masks and we're not locking down. And instead of being able to learn from each other from the past that different states took, we just got mired in these politics. And in the end, why should your politics say anything about how you think we should respond to a pandemic, right? They're two very different things.
The interaction between Slaoui and the drug company CEOs who were competing to develop their respective COVID-19 vaccines, how did that play out? Was that largely friendly competition, and that was part of the secret sauce of getting to vaccines, or were there was Slaoui and others sort of monitoring and picking winners and losers in that race?
So they did decide winners and losers in the sense that the government chose which vaccines it was going to back, and it very deliberately chose 3 different technologies, in fact, all three technologies. But from that point forward, there wasn't a picking of winners and losers. It was what was going to work, what was going to get FDA approved, and then what was going to be able to scale and being able to make enough vaccines that it made a difference. So I guess you could say on the scale early on, of the vaccine technologies it was going to pursue, but then after that point, they did not, and there wasn't anybody better positioned than Moncef Slaoui to choose which vaccine technology to pursue. He's brought more vaccines to market than anyone in history and understands the business, and so he knew what he was doing. And I think you can see that because if another viable vaccine had emerged that hadn't been supported by Warp Speed, would have it by now, right?
What about in the process? I mean, we can get to after the fact, and then Slaoui departs the stage, I think, in 2021. So when getting into some of the things I'm sure listeners are thinking about, like all the promises that were made of the vaccines you can't give or get and so forth that turned out not to be true. We'll hold those off for a moment. The development of it. What was his posture, the conversations between him and pharma CEOs about the dangers of the vaccine? Were there discussions about this is something for this is a disease or a virus that particularly impacts people that are older with comorbidities, and so we need to think about particularly side effects with younger people? side effects generally, but maybe particularly focused on young people and whether or not it's appropriate for everyone to take or necessary for everyone to take. Were there any conversations like that occurred throughout development?
So those sorts of concerns should be addressed through the clinical trials, which address both safety and efficacy. So if there are problems, if there are major problems, they are supposed to come out in the clinical trials, and some of them did, which is why some of the vaccines got railed. For example, the blood clot issue with J&J's Johnson & Johnson's vaccine came out during the clinical trials, and that's why that vaccine was much slower to get approval than the mRNA vaccines. There was also a concerted effort to make sure that the clinical trials were diverse, given that at least in the initial hit, COVID appeared to be affecting people of color more than others, and so there was an effort to make sure that the clinical trial was diverse. I think the hope for the vaccines, which we can talk about, the hope for the vaccines was that if enough people got vaccinated, we would prevent transmission, that it would stop the virus. So I think the idea in developing the vaccines wasn't to say it'll work for this part of the population and it won't work for that part of the population. It was to develop a vaccine that would make the entire country safer, the entire world safer, and we can talk about whether or not that turned out to be true.
Well, yeah, I mean, but just on the front end of this, yeah. So the blood clotting with the J&J virus, the myocarditis, yeah, particularly for young people that we've sort of heard stories about, and then there was research done after the fact at showing a real heightened incidence of myocarditis among young men in particular, and that arguably the vaccine was more dangerous to healthy young men than was the virus. Did any of that come out of the clinical trials, enter into the discussion among these individuals?
It did not come out of the clinical trials, and I think the fact that that hasn't been a broader, more widely acknowledged topic of discussion is not a failure of those involved in Warp Speed, who did what they were supposed to do and did well. I think it's a failure of the American public health establishment to grapple with the complexities around the vaccine. We've continued in this country to push the vaccine in a way that other countries have not. Other countries are recommending boosters for the elderly, for instance, or for those with comorbidities, but they're not pushing the vaccine for everybody. And we're continuing in this country to have this blanket push for the vaccine, including for the very, very young. And I think that there's a real failure there and a legitimate loss of trust, because the public health establishment isn't willing to accept any nuance around who should take the vaccine and who shouldn't. It's just this blanket push.
Now, Bethany, during your research for this book, did your opinion about Dr. Anthony Fauci change at all?
So it didn't. I was a little skeptical from the very beginning of the strategy we were pursuing, and everybody who was endorsing it without willingness to listen to other voices. Meaning, and Dr. Fauci was definitely one of those people, but I think the failure is ultimately of our leaders, because a scientist like Dr. Fauci is, of course, going to push lockdowns and push everything he can to make people safer. It's the job of our politicians, the job of our leaders to say, yes, I understand this consideration on the one hand, and then here there are all these other considerations, like the need for children to be in school and the need for people to be able to make a living. And here's what we're going to do in order to balance these considerations. So if neither President Trump nor President Biden wanted to embrace what Dr. Fauci was saying, then they shouldn't have put him on the stage. In the end, that in my view is the problem, not with Dr. Fauci himself. Although some of the things that have emerged about his intolerance for those with different points of view on either lockdowns or where the virus came from, it's not great. The ability to discuss and debate and have different points of view is critical to a free society. And so when you have anyone in a position of power who's trying to shut that down rather than open that up, I think it's problematic.
What was the involvement, if any, of the public health troika at the time? So Redfield at CDC, Francis Collins at NIH, and Tony Fauci in Warp Speed.
So not very much, honestly. Fauci was a proponent of the mRNA vaccines. He thought that they were going to work, but really Warp Speed was conceived of by people within Health and Human Services, and I think Alex Azar, who was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, he deserves a lot of credit for this. He had worked in Big Pharma and worked in the Bush administration, and he understood what pharmaceutical companies needed from the government in order to get this done. And after Moncef Slaoui was selected to run it, along with General Gustav Perna, there really wasn't a lot of interference from other parts of the government. So it was I view Warp Speed as this very, whatever you think in the end of the vaccines, it was a very clean process done with the best of intentions.
So it's interesting because my sort of takeaway from what you're saying is that when we conceptualize everything that happened and try to wrap our minds around it, we have to be careful not to conflate things and parties. So the vaccine development was one thing by one group. The public health recommendations was another thing by another group. The decision to green light or red light those recommendations was another thing by another group, politicians. And if you start conflating the two, you're starting to ascribe blame or success to the wrong groups.
Thank you for saying what I was trying to say very clearly. I totally agree with that. I think Operation Warp Speed and the production of the original vaccines was a tremendous success. I think those vaccines do what the clinical trials said they would do, which is that they prevent death and hospitalization from COVID for most people. What happened after that, in terms of the push for the boosters, the vaccine mandates in various states, the failure to recognize that maybe some people should take the vaccine, continue to take boosters, and maybe some people shouldn't, the failure to grapple with what it means to have already had COVID and what that means in terms of the vaccine, those are all failings that came after Operation Warp Speed, and in my view, are separate from it and made by different people.
She is Bethany McLean, the author of The Smartest Guys in the Room about Enron, Shaky Ground about the 2008-2009 Great Recession, and now The Big Fail, what the pandemic revealed about who America protects and who it leaves behind. Bethany, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Dan and Amy using the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
At Consumer Cellular, you get the same exact coverage as the largest carriers, but for up to half the cost. Same thing, up to half the cost. Up to half the cost for the same thing. 50% the money for 100% the same thing. I hope I'm making myself clear. Consumer Cellular. When freedom calls, we're here to answer. Call us at 1-888-FREEDOM.
Half the cost savings based on cost of consumer